In this video, I address what some folks believe to be the hard part of getting into indie war games, and why it's far easier than you think. I love indie games, and if you've been watching this channel for a while, you probably know this about me. Indie tabletop war games and recently indie video games. I love them both. I love indie tabletop war games so much that I publish some with my good friend Vince. Our most recent, Repent Ye Foolish Gods, Pachow, there's a video about the game right there if you want to check it out, it just came out a few weeks ago. However, I've found over time that some folks don't seem to like indie games, and I want to figure out why so I can try to help. The indie in indie games is short for independent. It's maybe not a perfect description, but it usually means there's, not some big corporation and shareholders and whatnot and all that, behind the development and production of the indie content. That's how we get indie music and indie movies and indie comic books and, my favorite, indie games. It usually means that there's not like big money or big teams behind these titles either, and the art and the layout and the physical books themselves and all that stuff might not be super fancy, like with the gold foil on the edges of the pages and all that kind of stuff. But in indie tabletop war games, that's not the issue that I've been seeing lately. Generally, most indie war games are also miniature agnostic. What this means is that the game company that makes the game doesn't also sell corresponding miniatures for you to use in, said game. Making miniatures is pretty hard, actually, and pretty expensive, and there are tons of other companies out there already, that are selling miniatures of all types. Therefore, miniature agnostic games allow you to use whatever kind of miniatures you'd like to use to play the game. This is the way pretty much all tabletop war games used to be, like way back in the day. But then things changed. Games Workshop made miniatures before they made games. Well, let me say, before they made war games. Like technically, Games Workshop started as a very small company to make wooden backgammon and Go boards, which I did not know until I did a little bit of research, and now you know as well. Then, after doing that for a while, they then started selling other games and many other games made by other folks, like Dungeons & Dragons. They were the UK distributor for Dungeons & Dragons for quite a while. And then they started Citadel Miniatures like in 1979. They didn't launch their first miniatures rule set, miniatures wargaming rule set, which was, Warhammer Fantasy Battles, until 1983. They were making all kinds of sci-fi miniatures as well, and then they eventually launched Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader in 1987 to give those sci-fi miniatures something to do. Games Workshop was the company to kind of pioneer making the, official miniatures for their war games. They were the first company to be like, these are the miniatures you use with these games, right? As I said previous to this, you picked the rule set you wanted to play, and then you figured out the miniatures that you wanted to use for that game. GW told you exactly which models worked with their rule set and was happy to sell them to you. As they got bigger, they held more sway over what models you could and could not use at, big Warhammer events. Over time, other large companies, not as large as Games Workshop, of course, but large for the wargaming space, other large companies followed this same game plan, and people got very used to being told which models to buy for which game. Eventually, the idea of a miniature agnostic wargame became the outlier instead of the standard for tabletop wargames. And since most indie game companies don't have the ability to also make miniatures for their wargaming rule sets, then the idea of miniature agnostic games became firmly entrenched in the world of indie wargames. The two generally went hand in hand. Now, for most folks, this is absolutely fine, maybe even preferred. I know that I love coming up with miniatures for miniature agnostic games that I enjoy, whether it's kit bashing or 3D printing, or even just building regular minis from smaller companies. It's really pretty easy and fun. Now, Extensive kit bashing with like heavy conversions and like a lot of green stuff sculpting and all that kind of stuff. No one is saying that that's easy. I watch videos about people doing that kind of stuff all the time, and while they're interesting and sometimes give me ideas, my current kit bashing is far less fancy. I like simple head swaps and like weapon swaps and maybe adding some extra stuff on when I can, like more pouches, add a backpack, maybe a cape, things like that. That type of kit bashing can be easy, but still fun, and can also still really customize your models and make them your own. But honestly, you don't have to kit bash anything when you're coming up with models for a miniature agnostic game. There are so many companies out there that make plastic kits, like normal plastic kits on sprues, like Games Workshop and the other big players do, that you can use for any game that you can think of. Repent, ye foolish gods, which I mentioned earlier, you're going to need cultists, right? Now, luckily, North Star Military Figures makes Frostgrave cultists, but not just like one set of cultists. They make cultists, cultists 2, cultists 3, and now even cultist knights if you want them more heavily armored. These are regular HIPs, or high-impact polystyrene, plastic kits, and you put them together however you want to. They're like super incredibly modular. They're also incredibly easy to build, far easier than the current GW models, in my opinion. Usually, like the torso and the legs are one piece, right? Then you glue on like arms and then a head and maybe some accessories and stuff like that. Again, pouches and backpacks or whatever. None of that, the jump pack alone is 11 pieces nonsense. Plus, they do all kinds of other fantasy models and also sci-fi plastics in their Stargrave line. I've talked about all their stuff here on the channel before. Pachow. But here's the trick. You can also use Games Workshop models in miniature agnostic games. You could even use miniatures that you already have. Here's an example. A new game from the maker of Forbidden Psalm is out now, and it's called Legitimate Salvage. Here's the blurb. In Legitimate Salvage, you play as a crew of 4 members working off your debt to a company that refuses to pay hazard pay unless someone dies. You work for the R&R company who finds profit in rescuing those unfortunate enough to be lost to the great uncaring void of space. Pretty cool, and great art too. In the game, you run around these like dead space stations looking for salvage, and your characters wear vac suits. Vac suits are big and bulky spacesuits that protect you from the dangers of space, I guess, and also probably monsters. Do you know who else wears a big, bulky suit that protects them from the dangers of space and also probably monsters? Space Marines from Games Workshop. You might even already have some. If you wanted to make miniatures that look very much like the art in the book, you certainly could, but you could also just use regular old Space Marines from your collection and be nearly just as close. With miniature agnostic indie games, you can always use whatever models you want to use. Actually, you can use whatever models you want to use with any game from any company. The only time that you can't, I suppose, usually, maybe, is at like big official events put on by a specific company. If you showed up to a Games Workshop event at a big convention, then generally they won't let you use just any models but theirs, right, in the event. Now, personally, I think that this is lame, but it's their choice, and I don't play in any of their events anyway, so it doesn't really matter to me. I can tell you that big events at Adepticon this year for both like one-page rules and Trench Crusade totally allowed non-official models, but, different strokes for different folks. The hard part of indie games, at least as I hear from, people online, people in comments and things like that, is finding the miniatures to use, since the game company doesn't always tell you, what miniatures to use, right? Because they don't make miniatures. But in my opinion, that's not the hard part, that's the great part. The first thing I think of when considering a new indie game is this: do I already have models in my collection that'll work with this game? Think of how much money and time, both for building and for painting, that thinking like that can save you. I decided to start playing Prime Brothers in Grimdark Future from One Page Rules because I already had a ton of Primaris Marines that I built but never ended up painting or playing with from like way back in 8th edition Warhammer 40K. What if you don't have a big collection of miniatures to look through, right? You're still thinking about this new indie game, but you don't have anything in your collection that'll work in your mind, right? And the company that makes the game, they don't sell minis, right? So let's go back to that legitimate salvage game. You need some people in spacesuits. Now, what I would do is I would go to the website called Google, which is at www.google.com, link in the description below, and then type in spacesuit miniatures and then hit enter or return on your keyboard. All snark aside, I'd also add a little dash AI at the end of that to turn off the stupid AI response that you're going to get from Google. However, you will get useful links to sites like Etsy and other manufacturers and creators that can help you to find the miniatures that you want. There have never been more miniatures available on the market for you to purchase than there are right now. And it doesn't matter when you're watching this video in the future, it'll still be true. All it takes is the slightest amount of effort to either use a few models you already have in your collection or kit bash some stuff that you already have, laying around unbuilt, or go to your local game store and check out and see what they have available, or just let your fingers do the walking and search the internet for the models that you want to use. Honestly, most indie wargame creators will even give you ideas of what to try out for models for their game. Vince and I make a blog post every single time that we launch a new game with tons of suggestions of models that'll work for that title. It's really easy. So if you've been concerned about indie games because they don't have an attached line of miniatures for you to buy, understand that this is a feature, not a bug. Giving the player the agency to use the models that they like is the great part of miniature agnostic gaming. Try it out. What do you think? Do you love sourcing your own miniatures for indie games, or for any kind of games really? Or do you kind of stay away because there's not any official minis? Let us all know down in the comments below. And while you're down there, some depressmentation of the like button or of the hype button, if you're on your phone there on mobile, would certainly help the channel, and I would also very much appreciate it as well. While you're down there hitting buttons, there's a button that says subscribe, and if you haven't hit it already, you can hit it now. You'll see more videos like this every single Friday pushed in front of you. It's free. Thanks for watching.